The measures subsection is another part of the methods section. This section summarizes what is being measured or observed by the researcher. In this section, you want to be sure to summarize any survey items that you used that were important. So you should make sure the author tells the audience how many questions, that would be you, tell the audience how many questions were in your survey, about how many pages it was if needed. So if it's a 3-page survey, you can say that. What categories or variables were included in the survey. Usually you have each variable that's important, the really important ones have their own subsection within this, and you label it as that variable. So here in this example, you'll see someone might have had a depression as a very important variable. And in their description of it, you'll see several things that are important to put in a measures subsection for the variable of depression. So take a moment to look at that. The measures section will often include the exact way each variable or even construct or concept is measured. That's the job of it. The specific variable you're using to measure the construct. Let's say you did a study where you used the Beck Depression Inventory. That's a specific well-known depression scale. You would be sure to say that. You want to say who developed the measure, and citations are definitely needed. If you chose to use a measure that is someone else's intellectual property. Students often ask, well, what if I made it up myself? Well, you can either write that you wrote the questions yourself, or find some way to indicate that it wasn't somebody else's work. Usually, if you can probably get away with not writing it in a published report if you wrote the measures yourself, but as a student, it's probably a good idea to say that you developed the measures or wrote the measures yourself, if you did. Often you might need to include an operational definition of your variable. So what's your operational definition of depression and other things? That's where it goes in this section for just your most important variables. Example items, or we might say the sample items for each variable are included. So you want to be sure to give an example to the reader of what you wrote. So let's say one of the items on the survey is I am sad a lot. And the range of possible response options is 1 equals never to 5 equals always. A brief explanation of why you chose the measures you did is also helpful. And you can say that after you state the variable you used. You can just say, we chose the Beck Depression Inventory because it has been used in previous studies with similar participants. Reliability and validity of the measures, if known, are important, and these are listed in this section. You probably don't know that, but you might see in other people's other published works that there's a little symbol and it equals something. It sometimes refers to reliability and validity, or there's other ways that researchers describe their reliability and validity of their measures. Also in the measures section, you might need to include a theoretical definition, but only if you feel it's necessary. Usually that would go in the introduction section if you think it's necessary. You can refer to earlier descriptions of what a theoretical definition is in work that we discussed earlier if you need that. So a few last concerns or questions that you might have. Here's some of the questions I've heard students ask me. If you use measures in your study that are loosely based on someone else's measure, do you actually have to cite the other person's measure? Generally in psychology, we do that. So let's say you look at the Beck Depression Inventory and you decide to change a few items so it matches more of what you think is appropriate. You can say that you did that. Now, if you think it's really a lot different from what they did, you might not need to do it. If your questionnaire has variables on it that you're not planning to examine, do you need to report them? That's also a question that students ask. If you have demographic questions, for example, on the questionnaire, but you decide not to examine them, you probably don't need to report them. So let's say you measured ethnicity, but you didn't find anything interesting and it doesn't seem to be an important variable in what you're doing. You might not need to report it at all in your paper. Sometimes people collaborate and have very long surveys, and then you do not need to put all the other survey items that someone else has put in. You can simply say somewhere that your questions were part of a larger survey on a particular topic, if that's true. One last thing to mention, sometimes people write an analysis plan as the last section of the method section. So this would be a description of how they plan to analyze their results. So if you're simply doing a correlation, you might say a correlation will be run to learn whether there's an association between two variables. In this case, let's say it's job loss and depression. One reason to do this is it shows the audience that you as a student researcher, you know what variables you're going to use in your statistical analysis. It's probably a good idea to start thinking about it before you've analyzed it, because otherwise you might have questions that aren't easy to analyze and don't really work with statistical analysis. So you can go ahead and ask your instructor or your mentor if this is necessary in your report method section.